Affirmative action. Link to the original article is in the description for those who want to read the charts and tables at a higher resolution and be able to click to see all of the sources available. In 1997, Stephen Ebbinghaid found that being black is worth 230 points on the SAT, being Hispanic is worth 185 points, and being Asian costs you 50 points, and being a legacy is worth 160 points when applying to a university. I don't know of any similar recent analysis that has been done, so to estimate how much affirmative action is being done today, we have to infer from more aggregate data. And this is done by me looking at SAT score distributions by race and the racial composition of student bodies at universities, though I limited my analysis to the top 20 universities by average SAT because I don't want to lose my mind, and all SAT data is math and verbal only. So here are the top 20 universities by SAT selectivity and their racial composition. Again, click the article if you want to read those better. And we can compare the proportions of each racial group made up the 1478 plus SAT test scores and what percentage of admissions they were compared to their percentage of the 1478 plus test scores. And here's a table on that. And so based on this, whites quote-unquote should be 72.46% of all admitted students at the top 20 universities, presuming that on aggregate, whites and blacks with the same SAT are on average equivalent on basically everything else. And of course, this is not an outlandish assumption, as the races, when SAT scores are controlled for, do roughly the same, controlled for a whole host of factors, and found that members of each racial group for a given SAT score were virtually equivalent on the rest of the application on average. So when controlling for SAT scores, as long as we have large numbers, large groups, we can say that these are controlling for the overall quality of the application, because there's not systematic variation in overall quality of the application when SAT scores is controlled for. For individuals, I know there's a lot of variation there, but when comparing big, large groups, there's no variation or not significant variation between the big, large groups. So controlling for SAT is controlling for application quality. Now, doing all of this, whites should be 72.46%, black should be 0.67% of the students in the top 20 universities, Hispanics should be 2.81%, and Asians should be 24.06%. The deviations from these results result in whites only having 61.21% as many students in the top 20 universities as they should have, and Asians only getting 78.55% of their qualified students in. Hispanics get 370% as many students as they should, or 3.7 times, and blacks get a whopping 873%, right? Almost 9 times their representation that their SAT scores warrant. But with these numbers, we can figure out the average SAT, what the average SAT will be for the top 20 university attendees by race. And we can see that for whites, it would be 1516, blacks 1350, Hispanics 1393, Asians 1506. Now this may come as a surprise, but whites actually get punished more than Asians, both in terms of their representation as a percentage of qualified applicants and in terms of the point value of the discrimination against them. Now, I'm simply looking at the top 20 universities, not the top 100, or all of the universities, and so these results aren't necessarily applicable to all universities. But they probably are. Okay, holistic admissions. Following the passage of Proposition 209 in California, which forbade the usage of racial quotas in admissions, the University of California of the Cal State system adopted a holistic review process. Factors taken into consideration, in addition to SAT, GPA, honors classes, extracurriculars, were the Life Challenge Index and eligibility in the local context, which is just a way of saying class rank. Now, using class rank is a particularly devious tactic, as it allows elite universities to reach into black and Hispanic schools. The school you go to doesn't really matter at all, right? Going to a quote-unquote good school raises neither your SAT or GPA. Voucher studies have shown this, okay? And it's not going to result in you learning anything more. Okay, all going to a good school does is it stacks you up against smarter kids and lowers your class rank. So frankly, if you want to get into a good college, you're best off going to a quote-unquote bad school, because then you can put on your resume that you were at the top of your class and that you went to a quote-unquote bad school. So give me some pity points. Moreover, life difficulty, to the extent it is treated as synonymous with money, is not a relevant causal variable for IQ. We know that's true for IQ, and I have a link to that. But even when taking into consideration these questionable controls, right, that are cherry-picked to maximize the yield of blacks and Hispanic students at the UC system, it still wasn't working. Richard Sander got a hold of the actual holistic score data through a Freedom of Information Act request and found that even with all of these things taken into account, again, which I think are spurious anyway, the UC system still gives pure racial preferences, right? Showing that even when whites have, according to the UC holistic admissions score, the same supposed disadvantages as blacks and Hispanics, right? Low income, parents didn't go to college, bad school, etc. They're still giving blacks and Hispanics preferences. And of course, this data came from a Freedom of Information Act because the UC system refused to publish this data. But of course, they have to. They have to have pure racial quotas, because if they just went by various life challenge indicators, they'd be taking in mostly disadvantaged whites. Because whites at the bottom 10% do about as well as the blacks at the top 10% of family income. And to the extent that family income correlates with all these other life advantage or life disadvantage variables, right, it's going to result in whites at the very bottom of the holistic score doing about as well as blacks at the very top. Okay, and so universities must explicitly discriminate on purely racial lines if they want hardly any blacks in at all. Okay, and they must, to a lesser extent, do this for Hispanics as well. But in addition to all the circumstantial evidence, 42% of admissions officers say that membership in an underrepresented group is the most important variable, saying that this is more important than the applicant having exceptional talent. In fact, about 42% say membership in an underrepresented group is the most important thing, and 42% say exceptional talent. Coincidental with, or perhaps a response to, the fact that poor whites outperform upper-income blacks is the pushing of white privilege on whites in the poorest parts of the country, or saying that there is white privilege even among the very poorest whites, right? Because it can't be genetics, as race differences in cognitive abilities tied to genetics is not an allowable thing to think. That can't be allowed. These poor whites must be outperforming rich blacks for some sort of environmental reason, right? So the white privilege must be so ubiquitous, so powerful, that even these people, even the bottom 10% of whites, still have these terrific institutional privileges. Racial extremism at the universities. But it gets more extreme than that. An article from the American Conservative included Jews as a category for the population of elite universities. Now, this is important because Jews are lumped in with whites in almost all of the data. But since very few white people are Jews, it's important to distinguish Jewish from non-Jewish whites. Now, while whites were only 43.1% of the average population of the top 20 universities by SAT requirement in 2014, non-Jewish whites were a mere 23% of Ivy League schools, while Jews were 23%, also 23% of Ivy League schools. All right. The American Conservative also looked at other metrics with which to infer merit, looking at U.S. Math Olympiad teams, College Putnam Math winners, U.S. Physics Olympiad winners, Science Olympiad winners, Siemens Science AP winners, Science Talent Search finalists, NMS semifinals. I don't know what NMS stands for, National Math Science semifinalists, for whatever states they could find data for. And it's worth noting that in each of these tables add up to 100%, despite not having a black or Hispanic category. And based on this data, the author concluded that Jews are probably overrepresented at elite universities, even when controlling for all these indicators of merit that they're probably overrepresented by about a factor of 3. What this means, though, is that whites except Jews are heavily discriminated against through the use of holistic review in favor of Jews, who are overrepresented relative to their ability. Okay? So Jews are a high-performing group which also gets preferences and appear to be overrepresented even relative to their ability level. Okay? While non-Jewish whites are the ones that get the shaft. And so when Jews are disambiguated from non-Jews, the already kind of savage discrimination against whites at elite universities becomes even more extreme. I did not expect the universities to be this extreme when I started writing this article. Post-graduation privilege. The racial privilege of blacks and Hispanics is not limited to admissions to the undergraduate programs. In applications to medical schools, blacks and Hispanics get major bonuses on their MCAT and GPA. So one should try to stay away from black doctors, and one should prefer Asian doctors. For law schools, the Occidental Observer looked at the LSAT scores and found that being black was worth about 6 points for the top 14 law schools, or 7 points for the top 6 law schools. Because of how closely clustered LSAT scores are, a more meaningful way is to think of this in percentiles. So in order to get into a top 14 law school, a black only has to be in the top 77th percentile of all LSAT takers, whereas Caucasians or Asians have to be in the 93rd percentile to get into a top 14 law school. Thus, being black is worth leapfrogging 16% of whites at the top 6 law schools, and is worth leapfrogging 11% of whites at the top 14 law schools. These graduates, as illustrated more thoroughly in another article on the site linked in the article in the description, blacks with the same college credential are, on average, significantly less intelligent than whites at the same credential level. This is found using WordSum scores from the General Social Survey by race and education level. So a black person with a graduate degree or master's PhD will have only a slightly higher verbal IQ than a white person with a high school diploma. This black underperformance by education level is also found on adult literacy surveys, those involving prose or writing, document reading, and quantitative reasoning. What this means is that a black person with a college degree is only going to be slightly more competent than a white high school graduate, and the highest credentialed blacks will, on average, be slightly less competent than whites with basic four-year degrees. It is clear that the elite universities in the United States are discriminating against whites in an extreme manner, to the point where whites, particularly non-Jewish whites, are strictly underrepresented relative to their proportion of the population. By their population alone, whites should be around 55% of the people at these universities. And by their merit, they should be around 72%. But admissions officers have made sure that their average proportion of the student body is only 44.35%. The anti-white discrimination is not merely the disparate impact of controlling for social and economic factors. It is, and based on low-class whites outperforming high-class blacks, has to be a function of race itself. And it doesn't get better. When applying to law and medical schools, the blacks and Hispanics still perform worse and still get preferential treatment. And finally, once they have those degrees, the blacks are far less intelligent and competent than whites with the same credential, but this shouldn't be too surprising. This is the result of an impossible situation that the admissions officers are in, holding an environmental determinist view on race that was established in the civil rights era, disallowing racial genetic differences to even enter the discussion. And then, 50 years later, having made precisely zero progress beyond the direct results of affirmative action quotas that would be lost the moment these quotas were removed, they must find new explanations for this. And they must justify de facto racial quotas. And they must justify them to be even longer, and justify even more of them, and justify using them against poor whites as well. It's not traditional environmental disadvantages. No, the environmental effects must be more extreme, more exotic, more hidden. Genes can explain all these differences easily, but genes cannot enter into it because only racists think that way, and since it is racist, it must be wrong. Besides, we here at the elite universities, who established back in 1965 that all was environmentally determined, know that race realism is just suit and tie racism, and therefore it is incorrect. It is racist, therefore incorrect. And so, like a schizophrenic with mad delusions, these people keep trying to find the connections, keep imagining white privilege everywhere to explain why the poorest people in the country, whites from Appalachia, keep outperforming their precious, coddled, and pumped up rich blacks from the prep schools and tutors.